I'm Amelia Newcomb. I'm the Monitor's managing editor, and I'm really glad that you've chosen to join us today. I thought I'd start by giving you a little bit of background about what we're calling the Respect Project. It grew out of discussions about various values that sometimes seem in short supply at the moment in both the public square and in the private square as well. And the one we started to focus on immediately was respect. And we wanted to look at it across a variety of issues: politics and racial equity, religion, and education. Sometimes areas that sometimes, cause people to get a bit worked up. And so we wanted to look at who's doing the hard work of creating mutual respect at a moment in many countries where it can seem hard to come by. So we tasked a few writers with going out and seeing what kind of stories they could find. And what was really encouraging was that we didn't know what they would find, but they came back with really very substantial stories and ones where respect is operating. It wasn't just aspirational. And it underscored to us that there is another narrative out there if you're willing to see it and look for it and listen for it. And so what we hope to talk about today is stories where we've seen that happening, and also how learning about this can have an impact on all of us, both in our own lives and things we may do in our communities. So today we'll be talking with two Monitor correspondents in three arenas. One about politics and people who have very different points of view on issues. In schools, particularly around race and equity. And in Israel, among Jews and Arabs. So I'll introduce our two correspondents in just a moment, but first I'd like to turn to Dave Scott, who's our audience engagement editor. And in addition to talking with Sara and Dina, our two correspondents today, we have another very important point of this program, which is your participation. So we really want to hear your questions and your thoughts about what's being discussed, and Dave will explain how you can do that.
Hey, everybody. We would love to have you participate by sending in your questions for our panelists during the event. So to submit a question, click on the Q&A icon, which is the question and answer icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then type in your question. If you're on a PC, you may have to move your cursor to bring up the icons at the bottom of the screen. If you're on a smartphone, you may have to tap your screen to bring up the icon. And I'll be monitoring your questions and comments while the panelists are talking, and I'll be back later to share your questions. Oh, one last thing. If you'd like to use the closed caption feature, which is right next to the Q&A icon, you'll see a box with the CC, and underneath are the words live transcript. So if you click on the CC icon, you'll see three options, and then you click on the show subtitle. Thank you. I'll see you later.
And now I'm delighted to be joined by our two Monitor journalists. First, I'll introduce Sara Miller Llana. She's our Toronto bureau chief and one of the lead writers on the project. Bit of background again. This is Sara's third international bureau for the Monitor. She's also reported from Mexico City for several years and Paris for several years, covering first Latin America in its entirety and Europe in its entirety. And in fact, she's reported from 50 different countries in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish, on everything from politics to natural disasters to terrorism, as well as some fun stories as well. I'd also like to introduce Dina Kraft, who's joining us from north of Tel Aviv in Israel. Dina has long reported on Israeli and Palestinian politics, culture, and society. And she hosts a podcast that's called The Branch, which is really right up the alley of this discussion today. And it tells the stories of relationships between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. In the past, Dina's been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and she's also done extensive reporting on a restorative justice program at a Massachusetts prison. What's particularly wonderful about these two reporters is that they bring a deep sense of humanity to their work, and they have just reported from so many different communities, especially ones where the voices in those communities are not always heard. and that's why they're both involved in this project. And I just want to also extend a special thanks to Dina for joining us at this moment amid the conflict in Israel, and it's not an easy time. So we're very grateful to you for joining us, and we'll jump in. So Sara, when we first talked about this project, we ran through a variety of areas where we could look at respect. And you brought up actually a TV show that's very popular in Canada. And I have to say, it's really nice to hear about something that is about respect that is also really popular. So maybe you could share a little bit about that with us.
Sure. When we were talking about stories we could do, we were talking about respect in terms of really hearing and seeing one another. And we all know that that's missing in many political systems around the world today. So I was intrigued by this Canadian television show. It's called Political Blind Date. And what it does is it brings rivals from different sides of the ideological spectrum together. And they have to debate whatever they're fighting about. Usually it can be gun control, immigration, what have you. And they spend 2 days together, and they are forced to spend time with each other's constituents. And it's obviously entertainment. It's a television show, but it has a serious mission. The creators really want to shore up consensus in Canadian politics. So I decided to focus on an episode about taxation, because I think that's something that everyone in the world can relate to. And there was one moment in the episode that I looked at that really, for me, underlined a way out of this hyper polarization. I interviewed two Toronto city councillors, and one of them, Gary Crawford, calls himself a low taxes kind of guy, and his rival is Shelley Carroll. And when they were going to meet his constituents, he gave her a button to put on that read high property taxes, and he was wearing one that said low property taxes. So they go in and they're talking to his base, basically. And he told me after the fact that he realized that it actually made no sense, his own gimmick, because he realized that they actually really want the same thing. They want the residents of Toronto to be able to afford to live in their homes and to get services that they pay for via taxes. And this is a theme we're going to see over and over again in this Respect project, that humans essentially might be fighting, but they want the same thing. As he put it to me, he said he and Shelley have been sitting at opposite ends of the table, but they're sharing the same food.
That's such a good point. I love that insight that he came to. Dina, how from your part of the world does this issue of respect look like, and particularly rooted obviously in the Arab and Jewish contexts?
Yeah, so right now it feels like respect is in pretty short supply, but I'm happy to talk to you about some sort of some bright spots I'm seeing even in the midst of all of this. But I think respect goes very much to the core of this place and this culture, and to the shared sort of biblical roots of both Muslims and Jews in this country, and in this place, in this region. And as you know, this is a pretty harsh climate, lots of desert, and in the desert, to survive, you have to let strangers into your tent. And in biblical times, there was in the stories of Abraham, for example, a stranger comes into your tent and you wash their feet and you give them food and you give them water. And respect was about survival, because if you didn't respect the person nomad coming by your tent, and they didn't help you might not survive when you were going by somebody else's tent. So I think those notions of respect and of treating guests well are deeply, deeply imbued in the societies here. I mean, when I go to a Palestinian home, the first thing I'm offered is water or food, and also in a Jewish home and any kind of meeting. When I was back in the States for a few years living in Boston, one of the things I was struck by most was you go to meetings and nobody offers you any food or water or beverage or coffee or tea. That never happens in the Middle East. It's one of the first things you get. And a little example of sort of, I think, of mutual respect from the last few days. In a recent story I did about the internecine warfare between Jews and Arabs inside Israel, the sort of mob violence that has been shaking locals, I think even more than the rocket fire from Hamas, one could argue, is these sort of street brawls that have been happening, kind of Northern Ireland style. But at the same time, you have Arabs and Jews in places like Jaffa, which is a place I was reporting from, who are meeting in the bomb shelters together, Arabs and Jews in the same apartment buildings, and talking about, you talk about commonality over taxes. I mean, here the commonality is everybody wants their children to survive and to live and to thrive. And I was talking just yesterday to somebody from Jaffa, from one of these apartment buildings, and they were describing how, how the Arab residents were getting on their WhatsApp the news in Arabic from Al Jazeera first, and letting their Jewish neighbors know what was happening, and then the Arabic media, and then vice versa. And then when talk became sort of political in a group text and a group WhatsApp session, one of the Arab neighbors said to another Arab neighbor, "No, we're not sending anything political. We are neighbors here. We're just all sharing information and help each other out, but we're keeping this apolitical." And the Arab neighbor responded, "Oh yes, of course, I'll keep it. Forget that. We're gonna go back to not being political again." And they've been really working in harmony. This building of like 50 people, all trying to just get through. And again, the common thread of just wanting peace and wanting quiet to return.
That's really amazing. That's wonderful to hear. And I know it does, at these moments, you want to make sure you're hearing those voices that are there, but they're not necessarily the loudest ones amid a moment of conflict. And it really is important to remember that they're there. And part of that comes through something you've talked a lot about before, Dina, which is building connections between people. And I know you've said that you're interested in the intersections between those who aren't supposed to intersect in given situations. And I know you've dealt a lot with that in your podcast, which I mentioned was called The Branch. So what have you learned about how people build those connections? Some of them are under stress and immediate need, like the ones you just described, but building other more long-term connections in ways that may bear some real fruit.
Right. I mean, I think one of the big takeaways from all of this, and when the dust settles, what really has to be addressed is education. I mean, Jews and Arabs live very segregated lives in this country, but one of the few places they do come together are in a handful of bilingual schools where Arabic and Hebrew is taught, where there's complete symmetry. There are Arab and Hebrew head teachers, Arab and Hebrew head principals. And they, they're not just learning in Hebrew, they're also spitting in Arabic. They're also throwing spitballs with the teacher together in Arabic and Hebrew. I mean, it's a real on the ground connection. And I feel like that's a real place of learning and being together. I think it's, there's also in this really segregated world, you see people coming together in different sort of programs, sort of dialogue groups and whatnot. But what I've seen is that people who work on a day-to-day level together, as nurses together in the hospital, as teachers together in a school, as tour guides together, giving dual narrative tours, as one of the Monitor stories I wrote, environmentalists also working together for a common good. In that day-to-day interaction is where the best connections are made. And I think also in terms of legitimacy, I think a lot of, apropos respect, I think for both Palestinians and Jews sharing this very contested piece of land, it's about respecting each other's histories, and a lot of that gets lost, of course, in the fighting. Jews, of course, have a long trauma, the longest hatred of anti-Semitism and the creation of the state of Israel as a national homeland, as a refuge, and not feeling legitimized for that need. And Palestinians feeling like their history has been erased, and their traumas of what they call the Nakba of 1948, of Israel being created and their own lives being destroyed. Those stories not being acknowledged. So I feel like people who are able to see each other's narratives, people who are able to talk about what's really difficult, that's been my big takeaway in doing 20 plus interviews with pairs, is that people who could talk about what's hard, people who could dive really into it and share each other's stories and not be afraid to have those conversations are the people who actually end up being the closest friends. The people who sort of keep it on a very non-political surface level, it's okay. There's some respect there and that's okay, but they don't really form, I think, really like life-altering connections unless they go to what's hard.
And have you seen instances, like how do you enter that conversation? I know, Sarah, you have some thoughts on this too, but how do you start that conversation? Because I think you can often see people who are of goodwill, they know each other, but making that step into something that feels much more dangerous in some ways, or they're worried about, the dynamic that will emerge. How do they begin?
I think the most, from what I hear from people over and over again, is when they hear each other's family stories, that makes a really big impact. When you hear someone's story about a grandfather who, immigrated to Israel in the 1930s and left behind everything familiar, and his family, his or her family, perished in the Holocaust, and then they rebuilt their a new family here and a new life here on the Jewish side. That's a story that, is told many times over in different varieties, of course, and also Jews from Iraq and Morocco who were pushed out of their countries and became refugees. And then the stories of Palestinians and sort of what happened to them, and their families having to leave their home villages and be dispersed throughout the country or throughout the Middle East. I mean, I think those stories that people tell from the heart and that have names, they're not nameless, faceless people to anymore. These are people who come alive and in full living technicolor when you hear their family stories. And it's really hard to turn away, I think, from someone's personal story. And it feels less threatening, I think, when it's told not in terms of sort of what can feel like propaganda or talking points or one-sided perspectives, but from the heart stories, unfortunately, often rooted in trauma. But I think when people can hear that and feel that and see that, that it's not quite as scary. And it just gives context and it makes it real, and it reminds us of our shared humanity. And that sounds corny, but I think the personal story, the more personal and the more detailed, really can cut through some of the, what we have a lot of here, which is one-dimensional pictures of one another.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, because it is that common humanity and those events that people, just allows you to suddenly see something new in a person that you can relate to. It makes a lot of sense. I know, Sarah, you've talked also about things that can be barriers to delving into these topics as well, even certain values that we think are good, but may actually pose problems at times. I wondered if you could share that.
Well, yeah, in the Canadian context, it's interesting because Canadians are known for being polite. I mean, it's a bit of a myth because, the country is not a monolith, but Canadians are very kind. I was very welcomed when I got here. You hear the word sorry at every street corner. It's great, but there's a downside to it. As Dina was saying, when you have to get beyond the surface to actually have a meaningful conversation. And I do hear people complain sometimes that they're not willing to have difficult conversations, especially in a personal way, because they don't want to be rude or insulting. On the other side, I do think that it largely opens space for meaningful conversation to happen. The creators of Political Blind Date actually want to take the show to other countries. They've talked about the UK, they've talked about Israel, Dina, so you might have some competition for the branch. They're also talking to some networks in the US. And I asked the showrunner, do you really think that this could work in the US, where polite is definitely not the starting point? But he says he really thinks that this is a moment for this show, that if you decide, the key is deciding to be willing to go on a journey with someone. But if you make that decision, then those talking points are, dropped very quickly, and you have to engage and listen to one another, and you do hear one another.
Yeah.
If I can just jump in, I mean, I think, I was one of the episodes that I did was one of my favorites. It's about two feminists named Samech and Hamutal. And they came together. Their commonality was their fight against violence against women, femicide, which numbers have been going up both in Jewish and Arab society in recent years. So that's how they got to know each other, working on campaigns against that. And at the time that I interviewed them, it was around the time of the second women's march, 2 years after Trump was elected. And it was getting very political, and it was a sort of all these different orthodoxies. If you're Zionist, you can't be in the movement. If you're this, you can't be in the movement. And Samach, who was Palestinian, said, "What is happening in America? Why does everybody have to agree on everything?" She's like, that's so male, and we are women, and we are not Martin Luther King. We are Martha Luther Kings. And we are all different boats sailing in the same direction. And she's like, I don't understand why Americans, have to think they all have to agree. And I thought that was such a sort of a great concept. It's like, yeah, you don't have to agree on everything. And there's even, I heard recently here in Israel, there's an organization to bring secular and religious and Palestinian and Jewish together to agree on not 100%, but on 80%. And we can mostly agree probably on 80%, maybe not on all the most thorny things in the peace process and this and that, but even 80% would bring us to such a better level of calm and respect and understanding. And from there, build to another 20%. But I love what she had to say. And they are an example of two people who really have had very painful, long conversations, but have gone to a really, really high place in their connection.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point that agreement and respect don't have to be identical. I always love it, for example, at the Monitor when readers write in and they may strongly disagree with an article, but they present their case and it's quiet and thoughtful, but it may be pointed in what it says, but it's a way to have a conversation as opposed to shutting down a conversation. Which actually, the whole point about agreement and respect gets to another point about this whole project, which is learning what it really means to show respect and to really delve into what that word is all about, because it doesn't actually mean the same thing to everybody. I know, Sarah, that's something that came up in your reporting on one of the stories you've done for this project.
Yeah, well, I really experienced this firsthand. I started working on a story before our Respect project began about a group of Black mothers who had come together to form an advocacy group to fight racism in Ontario schools. And when we started the Respect project, I thought, oh, maybe this is a good fit because their fight is all about, respect and getting respect for their children in the school system. And over the past year, with their activism, but also with the global reckoning over racial injustice in the world, they've made some significant gains, but that's generated a certain backlash. So I was talking with a mother who's, quoted in my story. I tell her the story of her fight with her son. And I asked her, how do you fight for respect with respect? And she immediately, pushed back against my question in ways that I really didn't anticipate. And it led to this conversation about respect used as a tool historically to suppress minority voices or to maintain the status quo. My colleague Harry Brunius also writes quite a lot about this in a piece that he did as our intro. But that also became a very big part of my story.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to this idea that ideals and values aren't entirely neutral, right?
Exactly. So, I think that if I had done this story just as a regular Monitor story, I probably would have centered it around the fight and their gains. But because I was looking at their fight through a lens of respect, it ended up surfacing some really relevant points that I may have missed if I hadn't been looking at it in this way. And it ultimately, I believe, led to a much more complex story and closer to the truth of the reality of these mothers' lives.
So, in other words, you were kind of willing to go into perhaps a difficult space because it's not entirely what people expect from reporters, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that idea of neutrality, I think, is so important, and again became a really big part of my own work.
Well, to circle back to you, Dina, on these difficult discussions, obviously the issues we were talking about, race and conflict and politics, have been front and center so many places in the world, including where you're sitting. And I wondered if you could share some thoughts, I mean, on how we move forward, how you get to having some of these discussions perhaps more in the public square in a way that's uh, can nudge, if not drive things forward, maybe nudge them forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think something before several years ago, I was based in South Africa for the Associated Press. And I was there for the very last of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, which, as you may recall, was bringing together the different sides of the conflict, people who were part of the apartheid regime, Black South Africans who were very much harmed by the South African regime, and this idea of coming together and talking about, giving testimony about what happened. And I think a lot about that in the current conflict as well here. I mean, in most of the conventional wisdom is that a TRC can't happen until a conflict is over, and is behind you. But I kind of think that and I have seen there are attempts to actually have those sort of healing circles, as it were, in some places, including with bereaved parents, Palestinian parents on the Palestinian side who have lost children to the conflict, and Jewish parents who've lost children to the conflict, either as soldiers or as children. And it's remarkable how these people who have paid the ultimate price have found a way to find common cause, because they don't want anyone else to suffer the way they have suffered. They are part of a club, they describe, that they want no one else to join. So they feel this urgency, and that is, by telling their stories, but also acknowledging each other's pain. And it reminds me a lot of the restorative justice reporting that I did in the prison outside of Boston, where you had victims and offenders coming together to not right what was wrong, but try to make something terribly broken a little less broken and a little bit less traumatized, by asking questions and by being able to prod and pick and discuss and talk about a crime in a moment and the impact of that on them. So I think that is sort of a moment of hope, is sort of respect and healing and acknowledging the pain and acknowledging the harm that has been done. I think so much of the bottled up rage that you see on both sides is that both sides feel like the victim, right? And we're in this perpetual loop of victimhood without actually seeing the damage that one side does inflict on the other, and perpetuates everyone's pain. So I think any kind of place where there can be sort of testimonial and coming together, and explaining people how they impact upon another is a way out. And again, sort of finding common cause, finding things that people can work on together, whether it's the environment or whether it's education, but finding those places to connect, even when it's really, really hard to do so. But it also takes leadership, which I have to say, I've been heartened to hear seems to be happening on a very grassroots level right now. It's certainly not coming from above, but there are definitely a lot of grassroots things happening.
Well, based on what you both just said, and of course you've both reported from so many different situations, but it does suggest that there is, if you can get to it, sort of a common interest, if not yearning, to try to pull out of these frozen situations or, completely polarized situations. Is that too optimistic an outlook?
I don't think so at all. From all of the work, really all throughout Latin America and Europe, I do think, again, I've said this maybe 5 times already here on this meeting, but we all want the same things. We want to feel safe and secure, for our families to thrive, and the question is, how do we get there?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely room for hope, but I think it takes. We also have to be aware that, especially in the age of social media, there's a lot of one-sided stories, a lot of like fake news that gets spread around, a lot of self-righteousness that people like to step on their soapboxes and tell and share. But there's not a lot of, I think, not enough sort of patience for nuance and context. And I feel like that gets lost. And I think that's sort of the role of them. Frankly, that's why I'm very proud to be a Monitor reporter, is that I get to put that context in and put those voices in. And I think I've just even seen the feedback from this one last story about the Jewish Arab mob violence. People were very thankful for it, because to bring you into a deeper level and not just the he said, she said of it. But I think there's a very important role for the kind of stories that we tell. I hope we get to do more of it.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the values of that you both bring to your work, and so many other Monitor reporters do as well, because one thing I think that's easy to overlook is, as a journalist, asking those kind of questions and plumbing a little bit more deeply is not always easy. As Sara, as you said, when you came up against the respect thing, and initially it was a little bit challenging. But it also goes to the point that, you both said, if you ask those questions, you get a fuller, richer picture of what's going on, which is really important for everybody to still see that, yes, I recognize that. That's the way I feel, or that's the way I could interact with my neighbor, or whatever it happens to be. Well, this seems like a good moment to see what questions our audience may have. And Dave, do you have anything you'd like to kick us off with?
Thanks, Amelia. Yep, we've got lots of questions. So if you would like to send in your question, please simply click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And before we jump into the sort of meatier questions, Dina, can you just explain that you are not in a bomb shelter? Some folks are a little concerned about that.
Oh, thanks. First of all, thanks everybody for your concern. No, I'm actually not in a bomb shelter. I'm in an attic space, actually, on a kibbutz about 25 miles north of Tel Aviv, where some kind friends and family have invited us in. So I was very much running down to the bomb shelter several times a night in Tel Aviv, and decided to come north for a bit of a breather with my family 2 nights ago. And we decided to stay on an extra night now. But thank you for your concern.
So a number of Quippy folks have well, you two have both shared examples of how this concept of respect bubbles up at the grassroots level among neighbors and friends. But we have questions too about if you have any insights on how can this model or the spirit of that model be replicated at the leadership level, where opposite sides don't seem to have the same sort of interaction or desire to build respect. Do you guys have any insights in how that can bubble up?
You mean political leaders? Is that
exactly
the question? Okay.
Yeah.
So okay, so we've said this, but I'll say this again. I think that finding that human connection between leaders is key. Let me go back to the episode of Political Blind Date that I did. Those two leaders had spent 1 decade sort of fighting they knew each other for a very long time, and they'd been fighting in legislative chambers. And when they met in a coffee shop in Toronto, within the first few minutes, Gary Crawford, one of the counselors, shared with Shelley Carroll that he had a daughter with a disability. And Shelley Crawford raised a daughter diagnosed with autism. And it was such a aha moment for both of them. They had that in common this entire time. And they never knew it about each other. All they did was fight each other on taxation, higher taxes, lower taxes. And to have them have that common point together, which is such a huge and important part of each other's lives, it really formed a friendship between them. And they told me that they speak way more often than they did before. They run down to each other's offices. And I think that you just have this willingness to work together if you know something behind the politics.
Yeah, I think Canada's probably a better light right now in this part of the world, but and unfortunately, Netanyahu has very much fanned the flames of division. And I think it's an example actually on the other side of what happens and how damaging it is when a leader says that one group of citizens, i.e. Arab citizens, are a threat to the nation and paints them as like as a fifth column. I mean, of course, he wasn't the first person to do it, but he was the first prime minister to really say, these people are a danger. And in the 2015 elections to say, Israelis, i.e. Jews, go to the polls right now because the Arabs are coming to the polls in droves. And there was a lot of pushback against that. But there was also a lot of harm done. And more recently, he was actually courting, ironically, an Arab party, pretty conservative Arab party, to be in his coalition possibly. But I think, on the positive side, about 5 minutes before this war began, we were very close to a new government being formed with, for the first time, an Arab party included in the coalition. And so there you did have very strange bedfellows, people who were, pretty strident right-wing nationalists, and people who were religious, and people who were, from very different part of the political map, embracing an Arab political party. And in some ways, interestingly, the Arab political party, which is a very conservative party religiously, was finding common cause also with some religious people on the other side of the aisle. So I think there is some room for hope from that, from leaders. But I hope that because of this inter-Arab Jewish violence has so shaken people to their core, I really hope that leaders do come and rise up to the occasion. There's been not so much on the national level, unfortunately, with the exception of the president, who has a figurehead role in the country. The mayors in the Galilee have been talking to each other, have been reaching out to one another, have been having solidarity rallies together. So that gives me hope that on the level of mayor to mayor, we're having some leadership being shown.
Sara, we've got a number of questions too about the story of the Black moms dealing with respect and disrespect in the schools. And people would like you to elaborate a little bit more about this concept of how respect is seen as disrespectful, that dynamic there that goes on, and how she has navigated that.
Sure. So it's complicated. So as an equity advocate talked me through this and said that, what is the most respectful thing for one person, which would be to fight for their dignity of their child, can be seen as disrespectful to someone else. You know, in this context, you're saying that our teachers are racist or that our school is racist. And so it brings out this backlash where people are saying your fight is you are being disrespectful in your fight, you know, and that's where a lot of pushback happens, because historically that has been, you know, you be civil. Civility is a very loaded term. Be civil in your fight, or be quiet. You know, that comes up very often. And for everyone on this call, I really urge you to also read that intro piece that I referenced by Harry Brunius, because he really gets into sort of the historic ideas around this. In her case, it's that people have, you know, sent some anonymous threats about, you know, some of the things that they're fighting for. You know, when they've called out racism at the school board or what have you, they receive threats, they receive pushback, that they're, you know, using the race card, or that they're being reactionaries. And one thing she said is that she's constantly asked to prove it, prove it, prove it. If you say something's racist, somebody wants them to give them proof. And, you know, she feels that she does not have to give proof, that you should just believe what she says.
Good. We're also getting questions around sort of the generational, is there a generational divide in respect? And then another question that was related to that is, what lessons from the Hebrew/Arab schools can be applied to the divisions in the US between conservatives and progressives who increasingly avoid associating with each other?
Do you want to tackle that second question, Dina?
Sure. I'll do that first, and then we'll go to generational.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in the Arab Jewish schools, yeah, it's hard to exactly layer it on the American situation, but one of the first things I think that's very different is speaking each other's languages. And Hebrew is the dominant language in Israel, obviously, not obviously, it's the majority language. So obviously, Jewish students speaking Arabic is not something that we have to think about in America so much, but it is about getting into the culture as well. Because it's not just about language, it's about language, but it's about culture, and it's about religion. And it's about how people live as families and homes, for example. Like Arab families often live very multi-generational families together. And so when you go home to your friend's house, who's, if you're an Arab little girl and a Jewish girl, and you go to an Arab girl's house after school for a play date, and you see that her grandmother and mother and aunts and uncles all live together, like it's kind of irreplaceable, like to be inside the house, to be inside the homes. And I think that's what happens in the schools is the relationships don't just stay in the schools. They also spill out, of course, into their social lives. And also that life inside the school is not just about the kids. It is very much about the parents. And it's very much about creating an active generation of parents who can be influential in creating policy in their own towns and their own cities, and hopefully nationwide. And speaking out against racism, and speaking out against state-sponsored discrimination, and really seeing all the small ways, even the small and big ways, people can become invisible. So, for example, in textbooks in Jewish Arab schools, they have examples not just of the majority, the Jewish, the names that are used in a class to learn about English, for example, they're Arab names and Hebrew names, and there's in context from both religions and both holidays, because you see how much the minority side can feel left out, as I'm sure Sara knows from her reporting, right? So when you don't have anything about when a minority child doesn't see themselves in the textbooks and doesn't see themselves in the stories that they're reading or they're telling or the plays that they're putting on the stage, they feel left out. And they don't have also the role models to go to with those stories. So I think that's something that you can take from the schools. And also something that's very unique, but goes to the heart of the hard that we talked about, is they have these days they call the national days. So in Israel, it's Independence Day, it's Memorial Day, and those are very tricky days for Arab students in the classroom. And on the flip side, you have the stories of the Nakba. So what they do there is they bring the kids together for all these different assemblies and discussions about the different national days, but then to actually observe them in their, they also observe them on their own as well. So they have their own places to observe, Independence Day if you're Jewish, or Nakba Day if you're Arab, but they also come together to talk about them as a community as a whole too. So they kind of walk this interesting path of sort of sharing, but also differentiating when need be.
I just would jump in there and say, you mentioned the adults, the parents, and obviously when your kids are involved, people, it's very close to home, very close to the heart. Do you ever run into situations where people feel like, I want to take that step, but I might pay too much of a price for it, or maybe my child will pay, or something like that, where again, looking at these barriers to actually doing what they may want to do, but they worry too, and perhaps legitimately, that it may cost them to step outside the generally accepted framework of their community or their friends.
Right. I think definitely they get some people get pushback for putting their kids in these schools, but I think what's really interesting is that the waiting list for these schools is incredibly long. There is so much demand for these schools that they're already planning on building, more of these schools, although there's still unfortunately very small in number overall, but there is this hunger. There's this hunger, this palpable hunger to connect and be together. And it'll be really interesting to see now how the schools respond and what the enrollments are like, going forward in the fall. But I think for some families there is a price that they do get ostracized. But I think sort of what's different here, thinking about Jewish families in particular, is it's a very small country, so you have to come together for Sabbath dinner on Friday night, or for Shabbat lunch on a Saturday. People don't go too long without seeing each other, and because there's such a disparate range of views here, people are used to arguments around the table. Whether it's the holiday table or whatever it is, and you can have in the same family people voting for 5 or 6 different political parties. So although when you think about how polarized it is in America, I think there is some sort of hope when you look at the Israeli context, that the people in the same families can have very, very different views, but still come together overall as families. And they're just not, the culture is the opposite of Canada. They're not afraid of saying something gauche or wrong. But I think, and again, I don't think it really tears families apart. I think there's a certain acceptance that happens because there is such a range of views around the same table every Friday night.
And Sarah, did you want to take a shot at that generational divide?
Yeah, sure. So the question was whether there's different levels of respect within generations. Well, I have a 10-year-old, so I want to say yes in a way, because she probably says things to me that I would never have said to my mother. But in general, I want to believe that, that we're all really the same. I think more so than generations, I think it's the time in which we find ourselves, a time of social media where a lot of discussion is reduced to 140 characters. I think we all have less time. I've heard politicians here in Canada say that back in the old days, they used to, fight with each other on the floor, and then they would go have a big dinner together. And that doesn't happen as much today. And again, I don't think that's age or generation. I think it's the era that we're in right now, with these echo chambers and quick swipes and what have you.
Yeah. I have a quick thing to add about generations, just quickly, in terms of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. I mean, every generation has been very, very different here, starting from the 48 generation that was very sort of downtrodden and sort of in shock from the fact that, Israeli statehood happened. And the most recent generation before this current one were the ones, going into universities in large numbers, becoming doctors and lawyers, becoming part of the workforce. And this younger generation is very much present in universities and getting much more educated and joining the middle class on the one hand. On the other hand, very much listening to what's happening outside, apropos social media and the world becoming a smaller place, and taking the language of human rights and the language of Black Lives Matter and very much applying it to their own situation here. And I think there's a lot of synergy between the Palestinian cause right now and the Black Lives Matter cause. And they may not be a perfect fit, and there might be sort of some surface, these are two very complex and different issues in some ways, but I think there's a really interesting sort of in the new generation of Palestinian Arab citizens here of much more confidence in their parents and their grandparents, and much more willingness to say, yes, I may be an Israeli citizen, but I am Palestinian nationally, and I want to be heard in a much louder way.
The next question is probably one for Amelia, but anybody can jump in. We've had a number of questions around the sort of the false narratives, the lies that sometimes get fostered, particularly on the political scene. I'll just read one of these questions. A big concern for me is the false, the negative so-called news that doesn't encourage or even show respect. It seems to just push disrespect and anger. And why is this so important? And what's the monitor's role in combating that?
Well, I do think what we try to do is make sure that when we're delving into any subject, whether it's an educational issue or it's a political issue, that we make sure that we talk to a wide variety of people about what's going on. And, people who are actively thinking carefully about these subjects and may hold legitimately different points of view. And, we don't want to sit there and be the judge on everything, but we want to make sure that our goal is to make sure that we give within a story an accurate reflection of a range of opinion on something, and perhaps some of the challenges to an accurate representation of what's going on in the news. So I think the best thing we can do to be respectful of our readers, if I'm answering this question correctly, is to do really thorough reporting. And also, for reporters, and it's sort of thought of this when you were talking about social media, Sarah, consumers of news, as we say, oh, okay, I get that point of view, to really challenge ourselves each time to say, is there something I'm missing? Is there another way of looking at this that I might not naturally gravitate toward or be familiar with? And, I know a lot of reporters, when they're doing their interviews for a given story, they ask, who else should I talk to about this? And that's a natural question, but asking, who else might disagree with you that I should talk to about this? And the more we do that, I think that is hopefully a demonstration of respect. And it also makes for a stronger story, because it means you've really wrestled with the full range of issues that are informing a story. And, also part of respect is, as journalists, to admit if we got something wrong or we misinterpreted it as well. So I think that's part of the scenery also.
I would jump in here too. From this political blind date, I asked, why would a politician want to even go on this show? There's a lot to lose by doing this. And they said, respect really runs through the entire heart of this project, because politicians are disrespecting one another. They're disrespecting the citizenry, but also the media is disrespecting them by making a character out of them in a way, and by not looking at a leader, at any level of government as a human being, and never taking into consideration that a leader is missing so much family time because he or she is always working so hard and has to maybe travel to Ottawa, but the family lives in, London, Ontario, or what have you. So, Gary Crawford, the city councilor I interviewed, really said to me, like, I wanted to come on this show because I want people to, know who I am. So I think the media does play a big role there.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, I can think of a couple of cases recently where the reporters told us that the people they were interviewing said, nobody's ever asked me that question before. And it was something that got at their humanity or their experience that they've had that has informed what they're doing. And, that to me is what we try to do.
And I just want to jump in quickly with in the branch, one of the things I always ask it's pairs I usually talk to, is I ask them to describe who the other person is for them. Describe to me who this other person is and what they mean in your life. And they almost always sort of blush and look down and start smiling. And they say, no one's ever asked me that question. And it's about the question of their friendship is a bigger question. But of course, when they reflect to each other about what the other means to them, it's a really big moment for them. And it's always my favorite, like, I feel like such a gift to sort of give them, but also I feel so lucky to be there for that conversation and to hear what they mean. And it's the first time they've often articulated it. And it's really a thrill.
Sara and Dina, your reporting in these stories and others, you've seen a lot of examples where people have found a way to listen to each other and to show respect. We've got a number of people who are sort of wrestling with that process and trying to get there themselves. So I'm just going to read one of the questions, but there's many like this. What is it that inspires a willingness in the first place to simply listen to another's story? In my experience, this is the biggest obstacle, willingness to listen.
I would say, like, when the stakes are really high, like Dina was saying, this is new violence. I'll let you speak about this, but when the stakes are higher and you're seeing a new kind of violence, or something is personally affecting you or your family, your sense of safety, I think that's when a lot of openness, I think that's when people open to be willing to change, when they have a personal stake in it. What do you think, Dina?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a time, I mean, for example, I actually mentioned in my Monitor story about the violence is this one wonderful, there's a rap group in Jaffa where they rap in Arabic and Hebrew and Russian and Yiddish and Amharic and a little bit in English. And they have people from all of those backgrounds inside the group. And they've been writing this song about life in the bomb shelter, and they feel like, and they talk about how they are, even though they are politically across the map, they wrote right wing and far left wing and Marxist and this, they all really care about each other. And that's sort of, what they feel this urgency because they care about each other, and they've kind of grown up together as teenagers, and now they have children themselves, and their kids are bidding to grow up together, and they see the price is too high not to communicate and not to talk. But I would say the other thing I've learned is some people I've gotten to know have come to know each other by default because they just work together. They're two physiotherapists, or they're working together in a nonprofit. They kind of came together without sort of the plan to be listening, but the act of day by day working next to each other for a common cause, and whether it's healing people's bodies or whether it's teaching children, is within the doing comes the openness and they don't see each other as labels or as Arab and Jew. I often hear that often. I forget that they're an Arab. I forget that they're a Jew, which sometimes indicates to me that they're actually not listening very closely. But often it's because the labels fall apart and they're just human to each other. And then they can, I think, go to the deeper places and have the deeper conversations because they already have this glue of usually loving something, having a passion for something, and they both do that passion together, whether it's, getting in the theater, or whether it's now my most recent episode's coming up tomorrow or the next day about a choir in Jaffa, these women who sing together, and they have very, very different backgrounds socioeconomically and everything. And there were riots in Jaffa just a month and a half ago, which now in hindsight can look as sort of like a precursor to what we saw. And it was Arab and Jewish riots. And while they were having this party, their first post-corona party, they were singing around the piano in a woman's living room. In the midst of all this, they start hearing the fire of rubber bullets being fired, but their singing is sort of coming across, and this harmony is happening above the sounds of mayhem and clashes. And the rioters came out and said that song was beautiful. It was just beautiful. So I'm not really sure I'm going with this, but it was just like this sort of moment of like the harmony kind of, for a moment at least, drowning out the violence.
Those are great answers. Thank you. Did have a question too here about, as you're reporting this and looking into this, do you find is there a moment where respect becomes reconciliation? I mean, is there a process that you're observing or seeing where that there's a shift that goes on, and how does that happen? Can you talk? This may be our last question. We have one more after this perhaps, and then we're going to have to wrap up. But yeah, can you, either you or Amelia, talk about this process that you're seeing, if there is one, from respect to reconciliation?
Sara, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking back. I saw a lot of this, I suppose, in Europe, when there was a spate of terrorist attacks there, and seeing Jewish and Muslim communities come together and talking just about the stakes there. I've seen it a bit in Canada. There's a lot around reconciliation with Indigenous communities here. Um, they're it's farther apart, I think, at this point. There's a really hard conversation going on about reconciliation, and I think there's still a very big divide between what the government sees as reconciliation and what a lot of Indigenous communities see as reconciliation. But when I have met with Indigenous groups, there has been, I don't see reconciliation happening in real time, but sort of more of an understanding for where both sides are coming from.
Yeah. And I thought I'd weigh in actually not on the Middle East, but on some really inspiring work that I saw, as Amelia mentioned, doing reporting inside a prison outside of Boston, where they have restorative justice, or they had in the past at least, restorative justice retreats, where they would bring in people who themselves had lost loved ones to violent street crime, often men and women who lost sons to homicide in Boston. And often the men who were in prison for homicide, and not for killing their direct loved ones, but for murdering other people's loved ones. And the immense power of coming together in a circle. And again, the idea was a circle, always in a circle, but there's not one against or for, and sharing their stories, and for the victim families to ask their questions, like, how did you get on the street? What was the background of you joining a gang? What was your family backstory? And the men expressing, their shame, but also the sense of belonging that they got from being in these gangs, and how they saw their life as sort of one big patchwork of warfare from day one, and the childhoods that were very broken. Of course, you don't end up in prison if you've had a good life until then. Usually there's a backstory there. But what I saw the reconciliation come from is seeing how the violence doesn't come out of nothing, seeing how the violence comes out of themselves being hurt. And there was a sign on the wall in one of these classrooms that said, hurt people, healed people, heal people. And the men themselves, who had to go through an incredible process of looking through their own lives and their own timelines of the harm they had suffered, and the way that they were then they passed on that harm to others. It was a real eye opener for the people who had lost loved ones, and it again didn't bring their loved ones back, but it did, as one woman described to me, bring their loved ones forward, and together, sort of with the loved ones that were not there, and with the people who were in the room, there was this ability to kind of connect and take a very big step forward, in hopes that this won't happen to other families as well.
One thing I would just add in the context of this is the issue of time. Sara, your story about the Black Mothers Group in Toronto, it played out over time. And you see that in your podcast as well, Dina. And sometimes I think, especially in the American context, we expect things to happen really fast. We want to see progress immediately. And of course we do. But giving people time, I think, also is an indication of respect, and even a little silence, like when you're listening, sometimes that means just sitting and absorbing it. But I think we are in such a fast-paced society at the moment, and social media moves so quickly that sometimes our expectations are a little bit high. And yet over time, if you start to absorb people's stories and absorb what it might mean, that, something you heard about a few months ago, suddenly you understand it better because of the time that's passed, or the extended conversation that can be. It seems to me that's something that crops up a lot in terms of laying the platform for better communication and respect. So.
I agree totally, especially with the pandemic. And I can't believe this is the first time we've said the word pandemic in this entire hour. But I think we sometimes forget that we're in the middle of a crisis. And so, the expectation, we're still in this crisis mode in a lot of politics, and with the pandemic, in lots of areas of our lives. And we are going to need time to understand everything and come back together.
Yeah, and apropos of time, Amelia, a lot of those families that go towards this process of restorative justice, they only get to it years down the line. And also for the men who are in prison, those first few years, they are angry, they are mad that they got caught. They always talk about, I caught a case, as if it was something that kind of just floated in the air and they caught it by mistake. And it takes them a long time to get over their anger and their own, survival, because unfortunately going to prison, you're about survival. For them, as they mature, unfortunately, a lot of these men will never leave prison. That's when they start looking back, and that's when they've had time to reflect, and then they can really get to the process of taking ownership for what they did, and to ask for apology and reparation, and for their side to sort of get what they need to be able to move on with less trauma. But it always takes time. It's not immediate ever.
Speaking of time, we're kind of at time. And I'd like to just thank everybody. We got over 140 questions and comments, and I'm just going to hand it back to you, Amelia, to close it out. Thank you.
Okay. And yes, thanks to everybody who submitted questions, and hopefully over time, maybe we can answer more of them. But I do have one last thing for Dina and Sara, but I first wanted to point out a feature that we're adding to these webinars. So immediately following the webinar, there'll be an opportunity for all of you who are listening to discuss this topic with your fellow attendees. So, you might think about, what are your reactions to our writers' examples of that ability of respect to challenge the narrative of deep divisions and polarity? And, have you seen similar instances of respect providing hope for healing major divides in your own community? Or, what advice would you provide to people in your community to foster greater respect? I mean, these are all good questions to ask, and the floor will be open for all of you to exchange your thoughts among yourselves. I'll just note that the chat will be moderated, and we'll outline the ground rules in the chat window right after this webinar. So that kind of leads in nicely to my final question, and you've been talking about this a little bit already, but what happens in our own lives? What do we do? We've talked a little bit about how it can be difficult to take first steps, but we're talking about issues in Canada and Israel right now, but how do we make the connection, or can we make the connection between how breakthroughs in the two stories we've discussed can be applied elsewhere, and particularly in a sort of on the ground way? Wondered if you had any closing thoughts about that.
Yeah, sure, I can jump in there. I every time I'm reporting, I learn so many things that I can take away in my own life. And in doing these stories, one of the things that came up was mediation. So we were talking about how in schools today, and the case that I write about is really a microcosm of a larger issue, where there are claims of racism, and then some people not seeing it because they can't see it or they don't want to see it. And often the conversation, unfortunately, happens over Facebook a lot of times, but the conversation quickly can become very toxic. And I was asking one of the women I interviewed, what do you do about that? And she said, you can't just throw people in a room together and say, talk about these issues, right? And she says, it's really helpful to have a mediator, because this is a skill. You really need someone to walk you through this very charged environment. So that's one thing that you can use. Of course, not everyone can hire a mediator, but that's something that businesses and schools can implement. The other thing, and I think this applies to more of us as individuals, we are doing a book page. It should be live tomorrow about books that have taught about respect. And I did a review of the Scout Mindset. And one of my big takeaways from that is that when you're dealing with disagreement and you want to understand the other side, don't go to the most extreme other side. Don't go to the most polarized view. Go to the more moderate voice where you can, find common ground with that person or that spokesperson or institution to really make better and more clear-headed decisions.
I like that. I like that. Moderation is really important. Something I saw very much in the restorative justice circles is always someone moderating it and someone making sure that everyone is being heard. And also one of the books that is Just Mercy is something I recommended by Brian Stevenson, who's a well-known, now very well-known figure in the civil rights world in America. But he cut his teeth on death row, representing death row inmates, and he talks about being proximate. And when you're proximate is when you're next to somebody and you're sort of not exactly walking in their shoes, but you're getting close to people that you would normally have no connection to and feeling empathy for them. And I'm seeing that play out on the ground right now, even in the midst of all of this, incredible, difficult, heartbreaking, heart-shattering moment between Jews and Arabs. There have been all of these solidarity rallies across the country on Thursday and on Friday and over the weekend. And then also I keep getting more invitations to Zoom conversations, and often people who have something commonality, like people really into meditation or people into women's issues. Again, like finding that common niche and then coming together. I got one tonight that was just like, hi, we are 6 women, Arabs and Jews. We're heartsick. We're having this conversation. Please join us tonight. Here's the Zoom link. Just very, very simple. And I think that's hopeful. People are doing it for themselves. They're not waiting around. And I think that's really encouraging.
Well, that's a very hopeful note to end on, and I appreciate it because, there is always hope. And I know you've talked, I love this phrase, so I just have to share it. Dina, you've shared from your podcast about some of the experiences being like little postcards of hope. And it's a great way to think about things. So thank you both so much for talking with us today, Dina, particularly under the circumstances that you're dealing with right now, and Sara as well. It's just been very insightful and helpful, and we really appreciate all the reporting you've brought to the Respect Project and to other stories that you've done for the Monitor. I want to thank some other people as well. Our engagement editor, Dave Scott, who you all have seen, for fielding your questions and comments. And we'd also like to thank our events team, which is led by promotion and events manager Lauren Crandall, producer Greg Fitzgerald, along with Lena Carlson, Rachel Schuler, and Cortland Reekston. The Monitor's product owner is Kim Proctor. So thanks again for joining us. I'm the Monitor's managing editor, Amelia Newcomb. See you next time.